Now, I want to complicate that a little bit. The next thing that I want to do is let's look at acts of violence, and then the following. Right? I want to look at acts of violence on the one hand, and then acts of genocide, and acts of murder. Okay. This overlap between the two is what I'll explain in a second. And obviously this is the overlap between all those things considered genocide and those things considered murder within a class of things considered violence. Clearly this is far more complicated than this. It'll get more complicated in a second, but this is more complicated than this, right? What we're saying in this is the following, right? Well, it'll be the same as before, right? We're saying that all acts of genocide, and acts of murder, right? Because it's murder and genocide is both contained within this large circle violence. So all acts of genocide and acts of murder, right? So all acts of genocide and acts of murder are acts of violence, right? Are acts of violence, right? So we make the claim that all acts of genocide and acts of murder are acts of violence. However, right? However, the question is, are all acts of genocide acts of murder? Well, no, there's only a bit, and actually it probably would be a lot more, but there's only a few of the acts of genocide that involve killing. We've seen in the second formulation, not the second formulation, what am I talking about? In Article 2 of the Prevention and Punishment Against Crimes of Genocide, in Article 2, E, Group E, spoke with acts, class of acts E, spoke to forcibly transferring children from one group to another. It is an act of genocide if accompanied by the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. The act of forcibly transferring children from one group to another does not involve murdering anybody, right? It'll lead to the destruction of the group, but it doesn't involve the act of murder at all. So that we have classes or acts of genocide, acts E, in Article 2 of the UNGC that aren't acts of murder. So there are some acts of genocide that are acts of murder, but not all acts of genocide are acts of murder, right? It's different, right? So this is what we have. So in this, it takes a little bit more explanation. So we have the claim that all acts of genocide and acts of murder are acts of violence. However, only some acts, right? Only some acts of genocide, Genocide, are acts of, right? So from this simple diagram, it's not too simple, but from this relatively simple diagram, we were able to formulate two very sort of, rich, philosophically rich sentences. All acts of genocide and acts of murder are acts of violence. However, only some acts of genocide are acts of murder, right? And that's what this says, right? And we have an understanding of what that means. This is very rich. There's a lot of data that can be mined from that claim. The point of me putting this up here is to show you sort of how Venn diagrams are constructed and how you can use Venn diagrams prior to even sitting down and writing anything or analyzing anything or thinking about anything, is you just sort of, I wonder how this relationship would work to this, and does that make sense here, and da-da-da. And before you know it, you've got pretty solid argumentation to support the claims that are apparent within your diagram. Okay, now to complicate it even further, right? To complicate it even further, and I don't want to just make it exceedingly complicated, but to complicate it even further, I'll give one more example, and with respect to Raphael Lemkin's account of the attempt to destroy human groups. Remember, prior to our discussion and his incorporation, or his introduction rather, of the idea of genocide, he was talking about barbarity vandalism, and the destruction of human groups, right? So that in an account of genocide, we can also, in a contemporary account of genocide, we can also describe the destruction of human groups in that.